coffee, drink some stuff. All that caffeine, stop my growth. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be looking at growth inside of our skeletal system, so essentially bone growth. Kind of the goal of this is to not only identify parts of the long bone that is growing, since the long bones kind of represent the majority of your growth as you say get taller, but also we need to talk about bone growth because your skeletal system is not look the same as it did when you were born, right? Because over time, your skeletal system increases in size, and how did that happens is really indicative of a lot of other things that we'll be talking about down the line. So talking about like motion and movement in general, it's all relative to the amount of bone growth that you're experiencing as you get bigger. Okay, so before we can talk about specifics of bone growth, we do need to identify and label some different parts of a basic long bone. Okay, because we're going to be talking about these different things in more detail as we continue forward through this lecture, it's important for us to just know kind of what things are. Okay, so what I have here is again a diagrammatic view, and you guys have this in your image handout that I've given you, where we can identify and label different parts of bone. Okay, so what I have here is a basic long bone. So in this case, right, we're looking at our humerus. I know it's the humerus because I can see our trochlea here. Okay, and let's just talk about what some of the different parts are. Okay, so let's start at kind of this end here. So this would be our proximal end of the bone. Okay, and let's just talk about the three major sections that are happening here. Okay, so a long bone is broken up into three major parts. Okay, so if I need that and this. Okay, all right, so these three major parts. The part up here, all right, which is proximal. All right, we call this part of the bone that's closest to kind of that articular area here. All right, we call it the proximal epiphysis. Epiphysis, okay? So the epiphysis is going to be kind of the areas that are kind of on top of, like epi means above, all right? Syphis means just kind of like an area where growth or joints are going to occur, okay? So this proximal end here is what's going to be closer. So we have a proximal epiphysis, and then here we're going to have our distal end. So again, we'll have our distal epiphysis, okay? All right, so in the proximal distal epiphysis is where we're going to actually have quite a few different things occur, okay? But I just want to point out where those are, okay? And then this main portion here is the diaphysis, okay? So this is kind of between your two epiphyses. And with the diaphysis, right, the other term that you might see is that this is called the shaft portion of the bone, okay? All right, it's kind of the same part, right? It's the elongated portion of the long bone where actually we have this cavity here, and this cavity is where our marrow is. So we call this the marrow cavity, okay, which is kind of this internal part of our bone, okay? All right, so as we move kind of into the internal anatomy of the bone, right, there are a few different areas here. So you can see here this kind of outside layer that's going around each of the portions of the bone, right? And then there's an even outer side layer that's shown here kind of in this fold, okay? So this area here that's surrounding all of our bone, right, it's kind of a layer of epithelium and connective tissue that surrounds all of our bone. We call this the periosteum. So anything peri, right, means to surround or go around. Osteo refers to bone. So this is actually a layer that's going around the bone. Okay, so that's our periosteum. Okay, as you see here, as we move deeper into the bone, okay, we can see that there's this layer of dense bone, which we learned as compact bone. Okay, this is what is making up like most of that really dense osteons that are coming together to form the structural support inside of your bone. Okay, and then actually on the very inner portion of our bone, we have a layer. Okay, this is called the endosteum. So the endosteum is just a layer of epithelium that's kind of surrounding the inside. And this layer here is where we have a lot of exchange occurring between the canaliculi that are deep inside of the bone, right? And then kind of where more of the bone marrow structures are in the inside of the bone, okay? All right, you have some other features that are in here. So as you see here, we have our compact bone, which is dense. Up here, you see kind of these air pockets here. This is spongy bone. Okay, it's called spongy bone because it's spongy looking, not because it's soft, okay? All right. You have lots of blood vessels that are going through all of your bones, okay? So again, your blood vessels do go into your bones, right? And that's why if you break a bone, it's bloody and gross, not because of like puncture your skin, because you do sever blood vessels when that happens, right? But the area that we're interested in is this area that's like right here, okay? So this is what you might have heard called your growth plate, okay? We call it your epiphyseal line. Okay, this is like essentially where growth is occurring in most of your bone. Okay, so as it elongates, right, it's happening at this epiphyseal line. Okay, the last thing that I want to just point out here is that at each end of the bone, you're going to have articular cartilage. Okay, so that's going to be at each of the portions of your bone at the long bone. Okay, so these basic features here, so the epiphysis, your diaphysis, the periosteum, the endosteum, and this epiphyseal line are all kind of major areas where we're going to see changes that occur due to growth in the bone. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight those things so you have this image and its diagrams, and you can look at that and use that to help us go through and talk about different portions of growth as a whole. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and get out the notes that we're going to be looking at as we talk about bone growth. Okay. All right, so love this notebook, 10 out of 10. All right, so let's talk about bone growth. Okay. All right, so bone growth, like I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, is something that happens for a large portion of your life. Like the moment you're born, you're continuing to grow, okay? So skeletal growth actually determines pretty much the body size proportion of what's going on inside of your body. So based on the genetics that are triggering different types of growth, right, that's going to lead to what proportion your body is going to be in, okay? So with skeletal growth, right, generally you are starting with growing the skeleton at 6 weeks within development. So basically while you're in the room, you're growing your skeleton, and your skeleton will continue to grow and solidify until you're approximately 25 years old. So lucky for you, you might grow that like extra quarter inch before you turn 25. Or some of us stop when we are like 12. Okay, so what's happening here is that our body is still changing. There are portions of our body that are continuing to grow. So what you might see in individuals as they start to age and turn 25 is that they'll have kind of solidifications of facial features. You'll have some additional growth that is going to occur in kind of smaller portions of your body, like in hips and those kinds of areas, kind of after you've done most of your growth upwards in terms of height. Okay, so again, kind of you generally like hit your limit for height when you're about 18 years old on average, but you'll continue to grow other portions of your skeleton. Okay. So bone growth is fascinating. It's super cool what happens to your body as you say convert this cartilage into the actual ossified bone. And bone forms essentially by replacing your cartilaginous skeleton that you have as a baby, and then kind of into this what we know as our average adult skeleton containing 206 bones, right? You have like anywhere from like 300 bones or something like that when you're a baby, and those as they start to fuse together and become one, you end up with only 206-ish bones when you're an adult. Okay, so bone forms by replacing cartilage and other connective tissue through the process known as ossification. So again, ossi refers to bone, ification means the process of changing into bone. Okay. So there are two different ways in which that can happen. So there's intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. So intramembranous happens when you have a membrane that starts to solidify. So this is like, say, what happens inside of your skull, right? Is that you have layers of membranous and rich connective tissue. Keep rubbing my head like you can see that, right? Let me go get a skeleton. Hold on. Sweet, magic. Okay, so here's a skeleton, right? So when you have inframembranous, it's like what's happening between the sutures inside of your skull, right? Is that as these two bones that are actually a whole bunch of cartilage start to fuse together, right? You'll see these suture lines that come together to actually create this kind of hard structure that allows for your skull to be protected. Okay, but as a baby, right, it's got to be cartilage because your head, if it was like this, going through the vaginal canal as you're being born, it's not going to go. It's not going to go, right? You need that flexibility inside of your skull, right, so that your head can actually squeeze through that area as you're being born. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about each of those different types here. Okay, so of those two forms, let's talk about intramembranous ossification. Okay, so what happens with intramembranous, so within the membrane ossification, this occurs when osteoblasts start to differentiate within embryonic or fetal fibrous connective tissue. So what that essentially means is in the connective tissue that's happening between the membranes of your different kind of solidified cartilage or that early bone that's starting to form, those osteoblasts, right, will come in and start building the actual calcium carbonate matrix and actually start putting that together. Okay, so in that fetal connective tissue, you're going to actually have those features come together. Okay, and so what this actually happens is it's usually in layers that are deep of the dermis. So we didn't talk about like layers of the skin, but this is a layer that's going to be super deep, right? Lower than your superficial, like stratified squamous epithelium. This is like really far down into what's going on. So like kind of like right either on the layer that's going to be bone or just deep to that. Okay, and so this begins to start to solidify and change as we start depositing calcium. So as the baby starts to accumulate more and more of this calcium-rich substances in the bone, it ends up getting deposited. So again, what we're doing is we're actually adding calcium salts into the matrix. Okay, so you're adding that calcium phosphate. Okay, that's going to be solidified there, and it's going to stay there until you need it for some other thing later. Okay, so what's happening in the whole process of your skeleton converting from this kind of softer cartilaginous skeleton into a solidified hard matrix skeleton, right, is this is kind of where ossification begins. And it begins in this inframembranous one, okay? So this is what's like happening inside of your skull in all those different areas, okay? So with this, bone is going to start then generating kind of these sheets, and they produce really like the flat bones. Okay, so you know, your flat bones are flat because they were layers of membrane that are coming together and solidifying. Okay, so this generally starts to kind of produce those particular sheets of bone, right, as they start to fuse sutures, symphyses come together, right, and start to fuse and keep those bones until they're kind of one solid piece. Okay, so the thing with this bone is that it really then starts kind of being spongy initially, so that cartilage kind of fills in, kind of networks together, and then we fill in those spaces with more compact bone. Okay, so this starts to fill with lots and lots of osteons, okay, that come in and actually allow the bone to stick together. Okay, so intramembranous, what you really need to know is that intramembranous ossification is going to be kind of between flat bones. We start to fuse them together into one big sheet of bone. Okay, so let's talk more about what's going on with endochondral ossification. So this is more about what's happening in, say, your long bones. Okay, so kind of the really interesting one. Okay, so endochondral, so endo means within, chondral means within cartilage. So endochondral ossification is the ossification that's happening inside of your cartilage. Okay, and so essentially what this is happening, or what this is doing, is that as we form bone into kind of these longer sheets, we're forming bone from hyaline cartilage. Okay, so we know what hyaline cartilage looks like, right? You've got the matrix that's rich in kind of this gel-like substance that can become calcified really easily, and then you have the lacunae that are surrounding particular chondrocytes. Okay, so what's happening here is that the cartilage will start to form initially, okay, which builds the kind of the initial structure because it's easy to build cartilage. You're not needing to add all of these different hard compounds, and then as you grow, it begins to ossify. So the matrix starts to convert from this kind of liquidy ground substance to this really hard calcium phosphate rich ground substance. Okay, so there are 5 steps that happen here. Okay, so the first thing that happens is your chondrocytes initially start to grow in size. They get bigger, which kind of pushes out the lacunae a little bit, and the matrix begins to calcify. So as it begins to calcify, those chondrocytes aren't making those connections between 2 other cells, or they can't like get materials through the kind of cartilaginous structures that are surrounding it, which has more of this liquid matrix that can allow the movement of materials. So what ends up happening is that as it calcifies, the chondrocytes end up killing themselves, right? So the chondrocytes end up dying. Okay, so when the chondrocytes die, the next step that happens is our bone begins to form, okay, at the shaft. Okay, so we start in the middle and we start to elongate outward. Okay, so by the shaft, I'm talking about what's happening in the diaphysis. Okay, so it begins in the shaft of the bone. So then the blood vessels what they will do is the osteoclasts will come in and start to break down different parts of the bone that allow blood vessels to begin to migrate into those areas. Okay, so as those vessels invade, the cells begin to start to differentiate into osteoblasts. So we've got kind of the osteoclasts that will start to divide, and you'll get osteoblasts. And what that'll end up happening is that the perichondrium, kind of the outer layer, so peri means around outside, chondrium, the outside layer of the cartilage bone at that point, will start to, again, solidify. So you'll get osteoblasts forming from these chondrocytes. Okay, so as those chondrocytes continue to move through, blood vessels will begin to continue to invade those inner regions, and we'll get kind of more spongier type bone in the inner part. And this is where we'll start to differentiate that even more so into kind of the marrow areas and some of the long bones, right? And then so this first area, kind of where that occurs, we call this primary ossification. So that's where we begin kind of formulating this kind of structure that's a lot more rigid, that builds these kind of stronger long bones like what you see in your arms and your legs, okay? And so that primary ossification. So then as we continue down with that primary ossification, we move into what we call secondary ossification. So the bones will start to enlarge. Okay, so the bone's osteoclast will come in, start breaking down this spongy bone, and then we start filling that area in with more and more osteons. Okay, so that spongy bone will kind of then go away, right? And that marrow cavity will really form, and then we can start differentiating in some more adipose and other stem cells that allow for the formation of different types of blood. Okay, and so this forms at each end of the bone and continues to grow and lengthen. So we've got the diaphysis, that primary ossification occurring, and the epiphyseal cartilage. Well, again, this is kind of where that growth plate is, right? Which will start to lengthen the bone overall, and what you get happening more as you start, in your early growth spurt when you're like 4 or 5, and then during puberty as you continue to grow during that point there. Okay, so as we move into our last step, right, the center of the epiphysis calcifies and begins forming the spongy bone in that secondary calcification or ossification. Okay, so there's kind of essentially a thin layer of cartilage that surrounds kind of the outside, so that'll either become part of the articular cartilage at the ends of the bone. So at each end of the long bone, you have articular cartilage that is there to provide a cushion, or there's a thin layer that starts to go away, and it's just what's left is your periosteum. So again, that connective tissue that's surrounding your bone. Okay, so with each of these different steps and everything that occurs as you move forward, right, what I have for you all is, again, a diagram of what that is and the stepwise structure that's going on there. So again, kind of a summary of the steps, okay? So what's happening with this image, as you can see here, right, is that it's labeled and you can see all the different things that are occurring, okay? So again, as we start with our cartilage bone, again, our long bone here, right, our chondrocytes start to enlarge, they start to calcify, and they begin to die. Okay. So as those happen, right, they start to increase and they start to push the length of the bone, right, and we start forming bone from the outside in. So we start forming this kind of denser bone and then a more spongy bone in the middle. Okay. So as that continues, right, blood vessels begin to invade. As blood vessels invade, right, we now get what we call primary ossification. We now have what is essentially a bone. Okay, so as those blood vessels start to migrate in, we have osteoclasts that come in and start to remove that bone to allow for that space to form for where we can get bone marrow coming in to help us produce and do other functions inside of the bone. Okay, so then from there, as we move into this area, right, the shaft of the bone thickens, right, we get that denser bone on the outside, and then our epiphysis, all right, is replaced at the shaft of the bone, right, so we now have these two different areas. So this epiphyseal cartilage that's here, right, this is what's going to allow us to continue to grow, okay, and then our secondary centers of ossification are where we're forming kind of those, the ends of the bone, where we're increasing the surface area here to allow for the joints to form, kind of where we have connections and articular stuff that's occurring on each of the ends. Okay, so again, we have another area where ossification is occurring. So we start filling in the shaft of the bone first, and then the epiphyseal areas that are here, and then this epiphyseal line is kind of what we get when we're an adult, but this is the growth plate that's continuing to grow and elongate the bone as you are growing, say, through puberty and initial growth spurts when you're a lot younger. Okay. Right. The other thing that we're having occur here is one thing that I also have for you guys is talking about kind of, again, what's happening with your bone as it's, say, getting longer, right, or getting wider. So kind of like that secondary growth on the outside that's occurring, right? So here's an infant, right? You've got that bone that's going to be kind of initially formed, right, kind of as the migration of materials from the outside in. So from that periosteum or perichondrium that's going to be the cartilage starts to come in. Right, our bone is going to start again getting reabsorbed. Right, we start depositing more and more. Right, thickening it, and then as an adult, again, you're left with that area that allows for the marrow to come in and allow you to carry out a lot of the other functions that you need to survive. Okay, so again, bone growth overall is going to accelerate during certain times of your life, such as what's going on during puberty. Again, when you have those growth spurts, again, those osteoblasts start to increase in their rate and they start just building a lot of bone, right? That's occurring at that epiphyseal cartilage. So what we're seeing here, okay? So this is kind of where that pubescent growth comes in, is going to be at this area. Okay. Right, and so then as that continues to get replaced and the bone gets longer, right, this is why you like grow 4 inches really, really fast. And it's because you have these bones that are essentially pulling your muscles, right, pulling everything apart and elongating the body overall, okay? So as you continue to get older, right, this is what's end up happening for a lot of your bone growth and say your 18s to 25s. So again, you kind of have the thickening of bone overall. And there are other things that can contribute to this. So like as we talked about exercise, one of the things that actually can increase the density of bone is actually doing exercise. By putting that excessive force on the bone, it can actually strengthen it overall. It'll lead you to having an individual bone that's going to be much thicker and much stronger as you increase in age. Okay, and then with adults, right, you've got kind of this chance for you to do that. So like I said, your bone is constantly being modified and constantly being changed. And even now, as like I'm getting older, right, my bone is still replacing itself, but the rate slows. Okay, so some people end up with things like osteoporosis, which is where just the osteoblasts aren't repairing bone as quickly or at all. And there are a lot of other things and diseases that can come from kind of errors with this that can lead to other drastic problems later on. All right, so that's it for bone growth. So if you've got questions, let me know.